150.000 usuarios comprometidos. Kirill ha recibido el premio al joven científico del Foro Económico Mundial y ha formado parte del Consejo de la Agencia Global del FEM sobre el futuro de la informática. Así que sin más dilación, pues recibamos con un fuerte aplauso a Tania.
Gracias, Irene. Para que Kirill pueda seguir también la presentación, si no os importa, haré la presentación en inglés y bueno, pues así podemos hacer luego la discusión o algunas preguntas que podamos participar todos. So, I would like to thank the organizers in the name of Kirill and me for the invitation of this great event. I think that it's a unique opportunity that we could share our project. That is called AIDA, and as you see, it's an assistant to integrate strategies for prevention in gastric cancer. And we call our session, Why do we need artificial intelligence assistance for gastric cancer prevention? And I will go firstly for the clinical impact on this. So these are my disclosures. And I will focus my talk in the gastric cancer epidemiological facts, the clinical aspects, which are the precancerous lesions, how we can detect them, how AI can help on this, and the project of AIDA, as well as the expected results, and also how each member of our consortium will support our project. This is a project that just started. We get funding from both the UK government and from the European Commission. We start in January, and we are very excited of having this idea that came from the collaborative partners that you will see later. How we really from the born designed this project, and at the end we got the funding, so we are very happy for that. So I would like to also put some numbers that I think that are important. These are data from Globocan, and as you can see, this is the data that we have of new cases of cancer in general. If we compare from 2020, how will this increase in the next 20 years? And this is because of different reasons, including the aging, but also the lifestyles, the environment, and also we could say that we are not doing enough in prevention. And this also applies for gastric cancer. As you can see, the numbers also are increasing in this, but not only the incidence, also the mortality will increase. And this is something that really concerns from the clinical point of view. And why is this? Because we are diagnosing gastric cancer very late. As you can see, there's a linear correlation in the different geographical areas among incidence and mortality. And also, if we are looking from the clinical point of view for a curative goal, is really a difficult management for the patient. You have to approach with a multidisciplinary approach, which will have to include perioperative chemotherapy, chemoradiation, and after that, the patient have to undergo a total gastrectomy in most of the cases. And then the impact on the quality of life of this, what is for the patient. Also, all this strategy is done, 60% of the patients will recur with the disease. So this is really an important health issue to deal. So how could we improve this situation? We think that we could do we have some ideas. So the first thing is what is around gastric cancer etiology. So we know that there will be some factors that will be related with the host, but others are from the environment, and especially there's an infection by a bacteria that most of you know, that is Helicobacter pylori, that causes gastritis, and at the end, a gastric cancer could be developed. And if we put this in a table with the level of evidence, we know that some of the risk factors are combining, as the Helicobacter pylori infection, but others, as smoking, are related with both. We can divide the stomach in two areas. We can talk about the cardiac for the proximal part of the stomach that is close to the esophagus, and the non-cardiac, the rest of the stomach. And you could see here which are the risk factors, and I want you to think how maybe, of course, we can do something to change our lifestyles to improve this, and this could impact on our health. And as I said, Helicobacter pylori infection and smoking are combined risk factors for gastric cancer development for both types. Then we have in the second level that, for example, the high consumption of fruit and vegetables protect, but on the contrary, if we add salty foods, really processed meat, these increase the risk. And for the cardiac ones, the obesity and the reflux increase the risk. There's another kind of infections with the Epstein-Barr virus that also cause gastric cancer, as well as the high consumption of alcohol. There are some autoimmunity diseases that are related, and the type 2 diabetes. And there in the third level, we know, and we are doing research to understand also how the high consumption of fiber could decrease this. In the females, the estrogen seems to have a protection, and there are some genetics variants that also have more risk. If we go to the data to see, okay, and from the infection agents, which are the ones that we really know that are related with cancer, you can see in green that Helicobacter pylori is the number one. Half of the world population is infected with this bacteria, and is the most convincing risk factor that we have related with this disease. So in some areas, and this is something that I didn't say before, for example, gastric cancer is more frequent in males and in Asiatic countries. So for example, in Japan, what they had done is to include in the national insurance system the coverage for the eradication of Helicobacter pylori, that the treatment include a treatment with antibiotics, basically. And you can see here in this graph how this intervention really decreased the impact on gastric cancer mortality. So the message here is that we know that this bacteria is really related with the disease in all the steps. First, we have changes in the epithelium. We have atrophic, so the epithelium change the type of cells that have it there. It's also related with the peptic disease, and at the end, gastric cancer. And these high impact pathogen cause a lot of morbidity and mortality, and that we have strategies of eradication. We have many studies that say that this could reduce the risk. So in Europe, what we have, and this was done by the European Microbiome and Helicobacter pylori study group, they perform a general Helicobacter pylori registry with the idea to include all the data coming of the different treatment schemes that are used in the practical clinic in Europe, trying to see how we can maybe choose the best effective scheme, and also to improve the guidelines and to have this information updated to really impact on this what we were talking just now. They started in 2012, and now currently they have almost 60,000 patients recruited for this registry, and this information will be also integrated in AIDA. As you can see, this register allows to compare the different treatment schemes that are used in Europe, and also to see which ones have the best efficacy on this eradication. But not only the eradication of Helicobacter is important, also screening is important, and this is a thing that is related with the national coverage on screening programs. And for example, in Asia, as you can see here in Japan, that they have a screening program for gastric cancer. This really impact on survival. because at the end you detect the disease in an early stage, because the problem is that we don't have symptoms until it is very, very late. And we can compare in this graph how we could see these survival rates comparing with the Western countries. So if we are not able to do this screening to all the population, and this is a health economic issue, maybe what we could do is to have like an easy test or a biomarker that could identify those patients at risk and put these people in a screening program and monitoring. So this is AIDA, and why we think that we could do this? Because we think that we have all the elements. First, we have time. This is important because from the normal mucosa to gastric cancer development, we have years. And this risk increase in each step, as I said, with the changes that we see in the epithelium, but we have time, that's important. And also we have the tools to identify these lesions. We have the endoscopy imaging that would diagnose this disease, and also we have the gold standard that is the pathology report. We also have a clear diagnosis of in which status we are and what we could do. We also have guidelines. We know how to manage these patients step by step. Not only Helicobacter pylori, but also other microbiome. So we have really a diversity, gastric microbial elements. And we see also that it's not the same, the microbiome that we have in a normal mucosa and in a patient that have gastric cancer. So we think also that this information is really true to, let's say, be able to identify an easy biomarker that maybe in the future we could have to identify those patients at risk. So as we could see, and this is like a general overview of why we think AIDA is an important assistant for gastric cancer prevention, there are modifiable factors that are related with our lifestyles. So we think that we can support patients in the population to improve these lifestyles, trying to avoid to have gastric cancer. There are others related with the host that maybe are not possible to change, but there are other ones that are in the guidelines, but nobody follow it because maybe this patient was not identified in the beginning that this should be in a screening program, should be monitored, and this is what our project looks to do. So AIDA will integrate data coming from the Helicobacter pylori registry, as I mentioned before. We have partners that will collaborate with endoscopy and pathology imaging, and we will also look into the pathway through the biomarkers, trying to have an assistant not only for the physicians to provide recommendations to the patient, but also for the patient to really try to keep their health as healthy as possible. So I will, this is important too, sorry, just to say these are the institutions that are participating in this project. We have experts in gastric inflammation, in gastric cancer, and AI and machine learning experts. So each of them is very important for our project to success. And I will leave my talk here because I would like Kirill that will give the technical details of how we will integrate all these heterogeneous data to make it possible for our project. Thanks so much.
Hello, Kirill.
Yes, I can hear you very well.
Okay, you can start presenting. Give me a second because I'm going to make sure that everyone can see it and hear it.
Okay, let me just try to. Okay, so present now, the entire screen. utilice. Can you see it? Josh? Can you see it?
Yeah, can you hear us?
Yeah, I can hear you. There is a little bit of echo on your side.
Is there echo now?
I think you can start whenever you want.
Pardon? Josh, I can't hear you. I think you're muted.
Yeah, you can start whenever you want. You are already live and everyone.
Oh, I'm already right. Like, fantastic. Thank you so much. Hola everybody, and it's great to be with you, Tania. Tania, thank you so much for your presentation. So I'm going to talk about the AI part of the AIDA project that we are currently working together with Tania and about 12 other partners. So it's great to be here. I'm talking from London. If you have any questions during my talk, please feel free to answer, and I hope the guys will put this question in the chat. So as Tania highlighted, the idea of the AIDA is to build an artificial intelligence assistant to help clinicians dealing with the gastric cancer inflammation. And the gastric cancer is developing through the cascade of the event, starting with the initiation of H. pylori and developing of inflammation, ultimately leading to the cancer lesion. So as part of that, we are going to generate quite a lot of data, both in terms of the molecular data or mixed technologies, including next generation sequencing technologies that produce the gene expression, microbiome, and other data sets, but also the classical endoscopy and pathology images, and also dealing with the large database of patient records and the previous applications of different therapeutic interventions to manage the Helicobacter pylori eradication and the specific treatment. So as part of that, we are going to work with as I said, with quite a few diverse data sets, and we built artificial intelligence assistant to help manage gastric cancer inflammation. But first I wanted to start introducing a little bit about the concept of machine learning for those of you who are in the medical field. Machine learning is a part of artificial intelligence, which is a broader set of technologies dealing with the human-computer interaction, robots, natural language processing, and many other aspects. So machine learning is a concept that learns from the data sets, and data in this context equals experience. And the basic ingredients or components of any machine learning algorithms are the data set itself, the learning task, because we need to know what we are aiming for, the algorithm or the model that is derived from the data and learn patterns from the data, and also, of course, the performance measure, because we need to know whether we're doing okay or not okay with regard to the specific task. In the context of AIDA, we are going to work with quite a heterogeneous data sets, and they will come in data tables, for example, like a protein expression or gene expression. They will come from imaging data that, for example, endoscopy or pathology images, or maybe even with application of mass spectrometry imaging, molecular imaging data sets. And also the network, because the biology works in the context of the networks, molecules interact with each other, and the natural way of representing the state of the biological systems in the context of pathways and networks are network structured data. So we're going to talk about different algorithms that can be applied in this context, and in particularly in the end, the graph and neural networks, which is currently state of the art in terms of the machine learning algorithm. The second component of machine learning is the model itself, because there can be different tasks. The task can be to classify samples. For example, that can be distinguished between different classes of elements. Can be, for example, the patient that are at risk of developing cancer versus the control group. It can be a predicted real valued number. That can be, for example, the blood pressure or glucose level, and that's what we call regression analysis. And as part of that, we have a loss function, because we need to define what we want to optimize in the context of machine learning, and that can be, for example, cross entropy for classification or mean square error for regression. And the algorithm itself, because we need to know how well we are progressing towards a given task, and we need to update, for example, the weights in the neural networks. And in this context, backpropagation algorithm can be applied, the optimization function. In the context of machine learning, we frequently distinguish between the unsupervised learning and supervised learning. In unsupervised settings, we've given the examples. We have the descriptions of these examples that can be different features of the data sets. For example, it can be age or mutation status, for example, for a given gene. And given this feature table, we want to learn the patterns or relationship between the unlabeled data objects. And in this context, we do not have a specific outcome that we want to predict, but rather we want to cluster the data based on their similarities or differences to different classes based on the features that we've been given. And that's very useful, usually, to detect outlying observations, for example, like normal patients, or simply to get a sense of what kind of strata or groups of patients have similar characteristics within the data sets. I have to say that in the context of machine learning, unsupervised learning is usually an art rather than a science, because it largely depends, the choice of the algorithm largely depends on the domain specific knowledge, and there is no kind of universal, let's say, clustering algorithm that would work best for all scenarios. In some cases, we would like to learn the patterns of the data that have, for example, spherical shape. In the other case, it can be a different shape of the clusters, and therefore it largely depends on the objectives that we want to achieve within the learning framework. With regard to supervised learning, it's quite the opposite, because here we have the prediction or we have the correct labels, and we want to establish the predictive model that would predict the corresponding labels based on the input features. So in following the previous example, for example, in the context of gastric cancer, it can be the mutation or status of CDH1 or an age that can be combined together to predict whether you have a risk of developing gastric cancer or not. And here we have the outcomes of interest, and the objective is to, based on the features, the input features, to get as close to outcomes as possible. And in this context, we have a specific performance measure that can be, for example, classification accuracy, and we can calculate how many samples out of the total number of samples will predicted correctly based on our training examples. And then if the model predicts these training examples well, we can deploy the model, what we call in the wild, and see how well it predicts the real outcome. And if the model predictive accuracy is really good, then say 9 out of 10 cancer patients predicted correctly, for example, then it means that the classification accuracy is 90%, and if the generalizability of the model is good, then it will predict with the same accuracy unseen example based on the input features, in this case, for example, CDH1 and age. The way we usually train the model, we split the data into the training and so-called validation set, where we learn from the given examples, the relationship between the input and output features, for example. And once we've trained the model, we deploy the model and test it on unseen data sets. And if the model is overfitted, for example, then it really works well on the training example. But once you deploy the model, it wouldn't predict the unseen data well. So that's why it's really important to test the model on unseen data and select the test set in a way that it's in the most unbiased way possible. So then you can really test the generalization or generalizability, let's say, of predictive model. With regard to the specifically neural networks, we usually evolve the model multiple times, and therefore during the training process, we split the data multiple times and we check through each evolution whether the model is performing good or not. And once that process is completed in iterative fashion, then the trained model is saved and applied to the test data to see its generalizability or general performance. So that's, in a nutshell, a very brief introduction to the basic concept of the machine learning before we're going deeper into what kind of tools we are going to use as part of the AIDA project. And the first thing I would start is that within the machine learning, there is another set of algorithms which is called reinforcement learning, and particularly with regard to the selection of the H. pylori eradication treatment, this set of algorithms is highly relevant, and I'll explain in a second why this is the case. So the H. pylori registry has been created several years ago by our collaborators in Portugal, and it includes record now, I think, of about 70,000 patients with the different treatments applied that exceed the lifetime experience of any human expert. And although there is a convergence for the quadruple therapy, there is still much room for improvement. Even the success rate currently is over 90%, but still even a several percentage point improvement on a large scale when this treatment are applied to a population would make a huge difference. Although there is a convergence with the quadruple therapy, there is still varying dosages and treatment changes, especially if the first line therapy doesn't work well. And we also have very heterogeneous data sets because the data sets been collected for H. pylori registry from different countries, and they have different patient demographic characteristics and also outcomes. So in terms of reinforcement learning, in a nutshell, what we try to learn, we try to reinforce in a way when the positive treatment is successful, we observe the patient state when it's transitioned to the infected to non-infective status, and we take and when the action is taken, and the action in this case would be a specific therapy that is applied to patient. And obviously, even the same patient, but with different demographic characteristics, may respond differently to a given treatment. And therefore, we would like to take into account what we call a patient state. And in this case, the patient state would be the clinical data, the demographic characteristics of an individual, and other parameters. And through the reinforcement learning, we try to learn the reward, to maximize the reward that the treatment being applied successfully. So H. pylori has been eradicated, and we punish when the treatment was not applied successfully. And we iterate this process multiple times until convergence happens and we find the optimal policy. An optimal policy in this case would be an optimal treatment selection. So this set of algorithm has been applied a lot in the context of gaming, for example, as well. And what we also need to consider that ensuring clinical safety as well, because some of the policies that are prescribed may not be, or may have side effects, for example, and other characteristics. And I think that's where the clinical safety embedding should be taken into account as constraints applied to the policy action space for the development of reinforcement learning outcomes. Also, the Bayesian framework, particularly in this context, is highly suitable because we're dealing with uncertainty of the data set. And in terms of the outcomes, basically our primary outcome to optimize the success of eradication of H. pylori, which is currently about 90%, but with this algorithm we hope to achieve a better rate, but at the same time also to reduce the number of retreatments and diagnostic tests applied, improve the appearance of associated pathologies, and specifically identify the patient that are at risk to be eradicated. And we started learning on these data sets and the current personalize the current quadruple therapy to improve eradication of H. pylori. So once we progress through the cascade of gastric cancer and the H. pylori, which causes inflammation, the next thing for us is to develop explainable artificial intelligence to interpret endoscopy and pathology images. And maybe with the use of additional technologies such as mass spectrometry imaging, for example, to characterize pathologies better. So I'm going to talk now quickly about what kind of tools we're planning to develop in this context and currently developing. So the problem is that current guidance recommends that patients who are at risk of developing gastric cancer need to undergo regular and timely surveillance within the certain intervals given the type of precancerous lesion. But currently 50%, or actually sometimes even over 50% of high-risk patients who they don't receive endoscopy surveillance within the recommended surveillance interval, and which leads to a poor diagnosis and ultimately treatment rate of gastric cancer as well. And what we aim to do is to develop a specific risk score to stratify the patients into different subgroups of precancerous lesion, which putting them at risk of developing gastric cancer, and develop an AI assisted surveillance to recommend them undergo specific surveillance within the given time frame that is recommended by the current guidances. And in particularly as an input for that, we would have endoscopic images and also reports and pathological images and reports. And ultimately, there are two ways of doing it. The first one is taking into account the report, which is written in language. There are some also given that there are multiple languages within the European Union, and so there is a challenge how to interpret them. But in principle, that can be done using state-of-the-art natural language models, which you have probably seen recently with the success of ChatGPT and other tools, which can interpret the reports basically and stratify the patients based on the written reports and the diagnosis that's performed in this report. But the more advanced way would be taking into account the images themselves and automating and streamlining the process of interpreting the endoscopy and pathology images to perform risk stratification of different precancerous lesions, gastric lesions, from normal to gastritis, intestinal metaplasia that is particular of interest for us, to dysplasia and cancer. And as you can see on the figure, that depending on the type of precancerous lesion, you have the different surveillance intervals currently recommended to monitor the change. And I think here for us would be together with our partners in different countries to establish a robust benchmark data sets to train the models and explain to endoscopists and pathologists what type of lesion it is and detect specific features of interest in this lesions. And for this specific one, because we have in this context only a small fraction of labeled examples, we have a huge number of unlabeled data sets that are relatively cheap to acquire, but only a fraction of labeled data sets, because in this context, for example, endoscopy images needs to be independently confirmed by a pathologist for the characterization of the type of lesions, and it's a very labor-intensive process. And in this particular context, the generative adversarial neural networks are particularly suitable because they work with both a small fraction of labeled examples and can handle unlabeled data sets, and compared to the convolutional neural networks, they perform really well when there is a relatively small number of annotated examples, and which ultimately converges to similar performance for a very large data set. But since these data sets are difficult to acquire, in this particular context, they are highly suitable, and that's the type of algorithms we are currently working on. And with regard to the specific performance of the characterization of independent of different lesion types, we are going to take into account the current endoscopy standards, and where 2 or 3 or multiple different endoscopists interpret the images, and the agreement between them, the consensus between them would be our gold standard with regard to the performance, which is roughly about 90% for intestinal metaplasia and for gastritis. And in parallel to them, we also may consider using the molecular imaging data sets, and in this case, mass spectrometry imaging technology is a truly remarkable technology because it generates additional big omics data sets, for example, lipids and metabolomics data sets for individual cells, and they can take into account the molecular characteristics of a given precancerous lesions or cancer itself, and also its surrounding environment. So I'm going to quickly show a couple of examples because my team has been working a lot with this type of data, and I thought that to give you a couple of very simple demonstrations how it works to streamline the detection of cancer, and also in the context of unsupervised learning, how it, based on the biochemical composition of tissue, it can classify also the cancerous lesion versus the surrounding stromal tissue. So the first example is really just a very simple conceptual idea. So on the left image we have, in this case, it's a colorectal cancer H&E stain image of colorectal adenocarcinomas, or there are different colorectal adenocarcinoma islands, the blood vessels, and surrounding muscle tissue. And here we have mass spectrometry image where for each pixel we acquire a large metabolic profile of 100 to 1,000 lipids approximately. And in this case, you can the size of the pixel is about 30 to 50 microns, and in this case, the mass spectrometry imaging technology is called DAISY. It's desorption electrospray ionization. And in this particular example, I'm going to explore the lipidomic profile of the tissue, and based on that lipid profile, we will aim to predict the cancerous stromal and muscle tissue and the blood vessels as well. And so the first thing is here it's to do the co-registration between the H&E stained image and mass spectrometry image. Now I'm selecting 3 different regions of interest. In this case, it's the tumor, blood vessel, and muscle tissue. Here, it's a very simple example. So I just wanted to give a couple of training examples from these specific regions of interest. And for each region, as I said, that we have about 10 to 15 profiles of lipids, and even from principal component analysis, which is unsupervised learning techniques, you can see that the blood vessels, muscle tissue, and tumor, they're clustered differently. So what it means is that their biochemical composition, and in this case, particularly lipids, and here you can see the number of mass spectra that are basically quantifying different lipids, where the intensity of the peak is proportional to relative abundance of a molecule, and the molecules themselves are separated according to mass to charge or molecular weight or mass to charge ratio. And here at the range between the 200 to 400 approximately, we have largely fatty acids, and above it, from about 500 and above, we have the lipid species, and each of the peaks represent a different molecular ion and a different fatty acid to lipid species. So just zooming in a specific region of interest, and here you can see that the molecule, for example, with the mass to charge ratio of 309.28 has the highest expression in tumor, a bit less in blood, and smaller in muscle. So you can consider it as a kind of biomarker, candidate marker, differentiating tumor versus surrounding tissue, for example, in this case. And of course, there are basically hundreds of these measurements performed, and hundreds of the molecules measured. And from unsupervised learning, just based on the molecular composition and biochemical composition, you can see that these 3 specific regions are quite different from each other. So now what I'm going to do, I'm going to train a very simple model, take into account the
Hi,
number
Kirill.
of training.
We're running out of time, so if you could wrap up so they can have some questions, that would be great. Thank you.
Okay. So if you're running out of time, so I'm just wanted to give an example. So we have 3 regions of interest, and we predicted each of these regions, and here we've reconstructed the colorectal cancer, which is highlighted in red color, the blood vessels in green, and surrounding muscle tissue in blue. So this is one example where the machine learning can learn from a limited set of examples. In this case, it was only 10, 15 profiles each. And of course, we've applied it for that specific tissue slide, but it can, once you have enough training examples to overcome slide-to-slide heterogeneity and variability, it can be deployed to automatically perform the detection of regions of interest. And similar the case only with the pathology and endoscopy data in a way. And this is another example of unsupervised learning, where the cancerous regions, without any input of pathologists, are separated from the surrounding stromal tissue in colorectal cancer as well. The cancerous regions highlighted in gray color. Okay, so since I need to wrap up, I'm going to talk 2 more minutes, not more, about the very exciting field of graph neural networks, because as part of the project, we're going to generate multi-omics data sets of to characterize precancerous cell types from the genomic, from the proteomics, perspective, and these data sets needs to be integrated, and graph neural networks are particularly suited because they operate in the context of pathways and networks, and you can leverage the network structure data to find the pathways and network motifs that would be that improve patient risk classification for the developing of gastric cancer. And in this particular case, we want to refine patient stratification based on these multi-omics data sets, in addition to the pathology endoscopy images I mentioned before. And a simple example that we performed in the past, you can take, for example, a molecule of interest, it interacts with the specific proteins, and based on how these proteins interact with the other proteins, you can predict its effect on molecular networks. You can learn from the existing, for example, anti-cancer drugs, the networks that are targeted by these drugs, and then you can pass through this model thousands of, for example, food molecules to identify what additional food molecules can target the pathways and networks that are currently used for anti-cancer therapies. And in that case, you can potentially design a food or dietary intervention that would help, in addition to the standard of care, improve the outcomes of cancer. And in the context of the AIDA project, we were thinking to take this model and develop it to help those patients who are at risk of developing cancer, to provide them additional dietary interventions and derive food-based molecules that would help them to reverse the lesion of interest. And here we've applied that context in the context of the COVID-19, and on the right you can see the protein and networks and pathway that are used by the virus to replicate, survive inside of the human organism, and we stimulate that process using graph neural networks. And on the other hand, you have food or existing drugs, for example, for drug repurposing, that would target this network. So in a way, we have a network or interactome driven drug repurposing and food model and food molecule selection to improve the potential therapies. And here you can see the kind of a food map where we've...
we need to kind of wrap it up, that we're 10 minutes over.
Okay. Okay. Where we discovered the molecules and map them on different ingredients. So on that note, I'm going to complete my talk. I wanted to say thank you so much for our collaborators, to Tania as well, and I'm going to open the floor to questions if you have any. Thank you so much for your attention.
Bueno, muchísimas gracias al doctor Kirill, a la doctora Tania. En esta ocasión nos hemos metido más de lleno en lo que es la inteligencia artificial aplicada a la medicina, y actualmente pues vamos a pasar una ronda breve de preguntas. Si tenéis alguna duda que queráis transmitirle a la doctora Tania, al doctor Kirill, es ahora o casi nunca. Hay que ser valientes, ¿eh?
George, can you translate, please?
Hi, my question would be for you, Kirill. Kirill, how would you deal with data shifts, as in like, because you've been talking a lot about diet is very important in these kind of things, and diet may change over the next few years. People might start eating different things. So then the models might be biased because they were like trained on people that were on a specific diet, and now they're changing to another diet. Could this be a problem?
I think this is an excellent example, and the diet play a really important and contributing factor in the development of gastric cancer, and also all cancer. And this is why we need to basically collect the data and refine the models based on the currently available data set. So yes, I mean, if the risk factor changes, we need to basically monitor how the risk factor changes as people change their diet, and ultimately take into account and refine the model performance, because the model that are currently trained may not be necessarily applicable to the patient, for example, 5 and 10 years after the model was built. That's why, yes, I mean, bias is a big problem for all observational studies, and that's why the model needs to be refined and updated to test how relevant it is for the current time.
Thanks. One last question from the YouTube section, very fast. They're asking if the data from the big project is publicly available and if the images you showed were from there.
Well, we aim to, of course, to try to make our data sets publicly available. Of course, there are constraints as well in terms of the patient data, but all the data that can be anonymized and will be publicly available as part of the project for sure.
Thanks a lot, Dr. Kirill. Muchas gracias, doctora Tania. Vamos a continuar ahora con el ponente que